The sound of her sobbing cut through the evening air like a knife, reaching Xavier Winters where he stood on the dusty platform of the Hill City train station in South Dakota, his worn leather saddlebag slung over one shoulder. It was late September in 1882, and the sun was setting behind the Black Hills, painting the sky in shades of burnt orange and deep purple. He had just returned from a cattle drive that had taken him through Wyoming and back, his pockets heavier with coin than they had been in months, his body weary from weeks in the saddle. The last thing he expected to see was a young woman crumpled on a wooden bench near the ticket office, her shoulders shaking with the force of her tears, a single carpetbag at her feet. Xavier hesitated for a moment, his dusty boots planted firmly on the platform. He was not the sort of man who thrust himself into other people's business without invitation. At 26 years old, he had learned that the world could be harsh and unforgiving, especially in these frontier towns where survival often meant keeping your head down and your gun loaded. But something about the sight of this woman, alone and clearly in distress, pulled at something deep in his chest. His mother had raised him better than to walk away from someone in need. He approached slowly, his spurs jingling softly with each step. As he drew closer, he could see that she was younger than he had first thought, perhaps 22 or 23, with dark blonde hair that had come loose from its pins and hung in disheveled waves around her face. Her dress was a simple blue calico, travel-worn but respectable, and her hands clutched a damp handkerchief as though it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. "Excuse me, miss," Xavier said, his voice low and gentle. He removed his hat, revealing sandy brown hair that needed a trim. "Are you all right? Can I help you with something?" The woman's head snapped up, and he found himself looking into a pair of eyes that were an unusual shade of green, like new grass after spring rain. They were red-rimmed and swollen from crying, and the look of fear that flashed across her face made him take an instinctive step backward. "I do not mean you any harm," he said quickly, holding up one hand in a gesture of peace. "I just saw you were upset, and I wanted to make sure you were safe." She stared at him for a long moment, her chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. Then, as if the sight of his concerned face was the final straw, her features crumpled and a fresh wave of tears spilled down her cheeks. "I am sorry," she managed to choke out between sobs. "I am not usually like this. I do not know what to do." Xavier glanced around the platform. The station master had already gone home for the evening, and the street beyond was quiet except for the distant sound of a piano playing in one of the saloons. He set his saddlebag down and crouched in front of the bench so he was at eye level with her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "What is your name?" he asked. "Zelda," she whispered, then seemed to gather herself slightly. "Zelda Sullivan. Miss Sullivan, I am Xavier Winters. I work at the Double J Ranch just outside of town. Now, I do not know what has happened to you, but I can see you are in some kind of trouble. Have you got anywhere to go tonight? Anyone expecting you?" Fresh tears welled up in her eyes. "No," she said, her voice breaking. "I was supposed to meet my cousin here. She wrote to me 2 months ago, said she had a position for me as a seamstress in her shop. I traveled all the way from Ohio. I spent nearly every cent I had on the train fare and what little food I could afford along the way. But when I got here and asked at the general store, they told me she died 3 weeks ago from scarlet fever. The shop is closed. There is no position. There is nothing." Xavier felt his jaw tighten with sympathy. He had seen too many stories like this in frontier towns, people arriving with hope in their hearts only to have it crushed by the harsh realities of life out west. "Do you have any money left at all?" he asked gently. Zelda reached into her reticule with shaking hands and pulled out a few coins. "75 cents," she said, her voice hollow. "That is all I have in the world." "And I suppose you cannot go back to Ohio." Her expression darkened and she looked away. "No, I cannot go back." Xavier recognized the tone in her voice, the way she said those last words with such finality. There was a story there, something that had driven her to leave everything she knew and travel halfway across the country to start over. He did not press her for details. Everyone had their reasons for coming west, and most of those reasons involved leaving something painful behind. He straightened up and put his hat back on, his mind working through the possibilities. He could not just leave her here on this platform with night falling and no place to go. Hill City was not a particularly dangerous town, but it was still a frontier settlement with its share of rough characters, especially after dark. A young woman alone with no money and no prospects would be vulnerable in ways he did not want to think about. "All right," he said, making a decision. "Here is what we are going to do. There is a boarding house not far from here, run by a woman named Mrs. Fletcher. She is a decent sort, a widow who takes in boarders to make ends meet. I am going to take you there and pay for a room for you for a few nights. That will give you some time to figure out what you want to do next." Zelda's eyes widened. "I cannot accept that," she said quickly. "I cannot take your money. I do not even know you." "You do not have much choice, Miss Sullivan," Xavier said, not unkindly. "You cannot sleep on this platform, and with 75 cents you cannot afford a room anywhere. Consider it a loan if it makes you feel better. You can pay me back when you get on your feet." She looked up at him with those startling green eyes, and he could see the war happening inside her, pride battling with desperation. Finally, desperation won. She nodded slowly, wiping at her face with her handkerchief. "Thank you," she whispered. "I do not know why you are being so kind to me, but thank you." Xavier picked up her carpet bag along with his own saddlebag. "My mother always said that kindness costs nothing and can mean everything. Come on, let us get you somewhere safe for the night." They walked through the streets of Hill City as dusk deepened into night. The town was small, with one main street lined with wooden buildings that had been thrown up quickly to serve the miners and ranchers who made their living in the Black Hills. The gold rush that had brought thousands to the area in the mid-1870s had slowed considerably, but there were still prospectors panning in the streams and working small claims in the hills. The town had settled into a more stable existence, though it still had the rough edges of a frontier settlement. Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house was a two-story structure painted white, with a wide porch and lace curtains in the windows. It looked warm and inviting compared to the stark buildings around it. Xavier knocked on the door and waited. After a moment, a plump woman in her 50s opened the door, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Xavier Winters," she said, her face breaking into a smile. "I heard you were back from the drive. Come in, come in." "Evening, Mrs. Fletcher," Xavier said, stepping into the entrance hall with Zelda behind him. "I have a favor to ask you. This is Miss Zelda Sullivan. She has had some hard luck, and she needs a room for a few nights while she sorts out her situation. I would like to pay for a week's room and board for her if you have space available. Mrs. Fletcher's sharp eyes took in Zelda's tear-stained face and bedraggled appearance, and her expression softened immediately. "Of course I have room, dear," she said, addressing Zelda directly. "You look absolutely worn out. Have you eaten?" Zelda shook her head. "Not since this morning," she admitted. "Well, that will not do at all. I have beef stew still warm on the stove and fresh bread. Xavier, you stay for supper too. You look half-starved yourself." Xavier had intended to head straight home to his small cabin on the ranch property, but the mention of beef stew made his stomach growl audibly, and Mrs. Fletcher took that as acceptance. She led them both to a dining room where a long table was set for boarders, though only two other people were present at this late hour, an elderly prospector and a young schoolteacher who nodded politely as they entered. Mrs. Fletcher brought out generous bowls of stew and thick slices of bread with butter, and Xavier found himself sitting across from Zelda, watching as she ate slowly, as if the simple act of having warm food in her belly was helping to calm her frayed nerves. The color began to return to her cheeks and some of the panic faded from her eyes. "So, Miss Sullivan," Mrs. Fletcher said as she sat down with her own cup of coffee, "Xavier mentioned you have had some trouble. If you do not mind my asking, what brought you to Hill City?" Zelda explained about her cousin and the seamstress position that no longer existed. Mrs. Fletcher listened with sympathetic clicking sounds and shook her head. "Poor Sarah," she said. "That was your cousin, I assume." "Yes, the fever took her quick. She was a sweet girl, very talented with a needle. Had a nice little business going." "Did anyone take over her shop?" Xavier asked. "No, the building is sitting empty. Her husband had passed a year before and she had no children. I believe her possessions were sent to relatives back east, but the shop itself is just closed up." An idea was forming in Xavier's mind, but he kept it to himself for the moment. First, he needed to understand more about Zelda's situation. After supper, Mrs. Fletcher showed Zelda to a small but clean room on the second floor, and Xavier waited downstairs in the parlor. When Mrs. Fletcher returned, she poured him a cup of coffee and sat down with a knowing look. "That is a kind thing you are doing," she said. "But you should know that a week's room and board is not going to solve that girl's problems. She needs work, and work is not easy to come by for a woman alone in this town." "She said she was trained as a seamstress," Xavier said. "Is that true, do you think? If Sarah sent for her, then I imagine it is. Sarah would not have offered a position to someone who could not do the work." "Why do you ask?" "I am just thinking," Xavier said slowly. "Thinking about what might be possible." Mrs. Fletcher smiled. "You are a good man, Xavier Winters. Your mother raised you right. Now you get yourself home and get some rest. You have been on the trail for weeks. That girl will still be here in the morning." Xavier finished his coffee and stood to leave. As he walked back through town toward the livery where he had left his horse, he could not stop thinking about Zelda Sullivan. There had been something in her eyes, beneath the tears and the fear, that spoke of strength and determination. She had traveled across the country alone, which took courage. She had not simply fallen apart completely even when her plans had crumbled. She had been crying, yes, but she had not given up. The next morning, Xavier woke early out of habit, even though he did not have to be at the ranch until later. He washed up, shaved, and put on a clean shirt before heading back into town. The general store was just opening when he arrived, and he found the proprietor, a man named George Hartley, sweeping the front step. "Morning, George," Xavier said. "I need some information about Sarah Sullivan's old shop." George leaned on his broom. "What about it? Who owns the building now?" "Bank took it over when Sarah died. She owed some back rent on the place." "Why, you looking to set up a business, maybe," Xavier said. "Who do I talk to about it?" "Clayton Morris at the bank. He handles all that, but I will warn you, Morris is a tough negotiator. He will squeeze every penny he can out of you." Xavier thanked him and walked down to the Hill City Bank, a solid brick building that looked out of place among the wooden structures. Clayton Morris was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a perpetual frown. He listened as Xavier explained that he was interested in the property that had housed the seamstress shop. "What would you want with that place?" Morris asked, suspicion evident in his voice. "I have a business proposition," Xavier said carefully. "How much does the bank want for it?" Morris named a figure that made Xavier wince internally, but it was not impossible. He had saved most of his wages from the past 2 years, living simply and spending little. He had been thinking about investing in something, though he had not known what. This was impulsive, perhaps even foolish, but something in his gut told him it was the right thing to do. "I will need to think about it," Xavier said. "Can I look at the property?" Morris handed him a key with obvious reluctance. "Bring this back by end of day," he said. "And do not think about making any offers unless you have cash money to back it up." Xavier took the key and walked to the small building that had been Sarah Sullivan's shop. It was on a side street just off the main road, a single-story structure with a large front window and a door that stuck slightly when he unlocked it. Inside, dust motes danced in the sunlight that streamed through the grimy glass. There was still a work table in the center of the room, a dress form in the corner, and shelves along one wall. The back room held a small stove and what looked like it had been storage for fabric and supplies, though most of that had been cleared out. It was not much, but it had potential. Xavier could see it in his mind's eye, cleaned up and stocked with thread and cloth, and all the things a seamstress would need. He could see Zelda working here, bent over her sewing, building a life for herself. He could see himself stopping by, maybe bringing her lunch, making sure she was settling in all right. He caught himself on that last thought and shook his head. He barely knew this woman. He had no business imagining a future that involved him being part of her life beyond this initial act of kindness. And yet, he could not shake the image. Xavier locked up the shop and went directly to Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house. Zelda was sitting in the parlor, dressed in the same blue calico dress but looking more composed than she had the night before. Her hair was neatly pinned up, and though her eyes were still sad, the raw panic had faded. "Mr. Winters," she said, standing when she saw him. "I was hoping to speak with you. I wanted to thank you properly for your generosity last night. Mrs. Fletcher has been so kind and the room is lovely, but I cannot stay here on your charity. I need to find work immediately." "What kind of work were you doing in Ohio?" Xavier asked, sitting down in a chair across from her. "I worked in a dress shop," she said. "I started as an apprentice when I was 14 and worked my way up. I can do everything from basic alterations to creating a dress from scratch. I am good with embroidery and detail work." "And you came out here because your cousin offered you a partnership?" "Yes. She wrote that her business was growing and she needed help. She was even going to let me have a room above the shop." Zelda's voice wavered slightly. It seemed like a perfect opportunity. A chance to start fresh and build something of my own. Xavier leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "What if I told you that opportunity might still exist?" Zelda looked at him with confusion. "I do not understand. I went to see your cousin's shop this morning. It is sitting empty. The bank owns it now and they want to sell. What if someone bought it and set it up as a seamstress shop again and hired you to run it?" Her eyes widened. "Mr. Winters, that is a wonderful idea, but I do not know anyone who would do such a thing. I do not have the money myself, and I do not know anyone in this town who would invest in a stranger's business venture." "You know me," Xavier said quietly. Zelda stared at him. "You cannot be serious." "I am completely serious. I have money saved, and I have been thinking about investing it in something that would benefit the community. This town needs a seamstress, Miss Sullivan. The nearest one is in Rapid City, which is a day's ride from here. Women are making their own dresses or going without. A good seamstress could make a decent living here." "But why would you do this for me?" Zelda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You do not know me at all." Xavier considered the question carefully. Why was he doing this? Part of it was simple compassion, the instinct to help someone in need. Part of it was practical, recognizing a business opportunity that made sense. But there was something else, something he could not quite name. When he had seen her crying on that platform, something in his chest had tightened, and the thought of simply walking away had been impossible. "Because I believe people deserve a chance," he said finally, "and because I think you would do well here if given the opportunity. Consider it a business investment. You run the shop, and once you start making a profit, you pay me back what I put in. We can work out fair terms." Zelda's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different from the ones he had seen the night before. These were tears of hope and relief and overwhelming gratitude. "I do not know what to say," she managed. "This is more than I could have dreamed of. But, Mr. Winters, what if I fail? What if the business does not succeed? You would lose your investment." "That is the risk with any business," Xavier said with a slight smile. "But I do not think you will fail, Miss Sullivan. Something tells me you are stronger than you think you are." Over the next few days, Xavier went through with the purchase of the shop, negotiating with Clayton Morris at the bank, and managing to get the price down slightly by paying in cash. Zelda threw herself into cleaning and organizing the space with an energy that was almost frantic, as if she were afraid the opportunity would vanish if she did not seize it immediately. Xavier helped her scrub the floors and windows, and Mrs. Fletcher donated some curtains and a rug to make the place more welcoming. The question of supplies was more complicated. To properly stock a seamstress shop required thread, needles, pins, scissors, and most importantly, fabric. Xavier gave Zelda money to purchase what she needed from George Hartley at the general store, but the selection was limited. The truly good materials would have to be ordered from suppliers in larger cities and shipped by rail, which would take time. "I can start with what is available here," Zelda said as they took inventory of what George could provide. "Basic cotton, some wool, thread in common colors. It is enough to do alterations and simple dresses. Once word gets out that I am here and I start bringing in money, I can order better materials." "Order them now," Xavier said. "Order what you need to do the kind of work you want to be known for. It is part of the investment." Zelda looked at him with an expression he was coming to recognize, that mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "Mr. Winters, you have already spent so much." "Xavier," he said. "Just call me Xavier, and I am not worried about the money. I have faith in you." As they worked together to set up the shop, Xavier found himself learning about Zelda in small increments. She was 23 years old, the daughter of a factory worker who had died when she was young, leaving her to be raised by an aunt who resented the burden. She had gone to work as soon as she was able, and her skill with a needle had been her salvation, the one thing that made her valuable. When her aunt had tried to force her into a marriage with a man twice her age, a cruel drunk who had already buried one wife, Zelda had refused. The aunt had thrown her out, and Zelda had been living in a boarding house in Cincinnati, barely scraping by, when her cousin's letter had arrived offering her a new start. "I knew I had to take the chance," she told Xavier as they hung curtains in the shop window. "Even though it was terrifying to travel so far alone, even though I was spending nearly every cent I had, I knew I could not stay where I was. I felt like I was drowning, and that letter was a rope thrown to me. I grabbed it." "You were brave," Xavier said, and he meant it. "I was desperate," Zelda corrected, but she smiled slightly. "Though I suppose sometimes they are the same thing." Xavier found himself making excuses to be in town, to stop by the shop and check on her progress. The ranch foreman, a gruff man named Tom Briggs, gave him knowing looks but said nothing. Xavier's work at the Double J was steady and reliable, and if he wanted to spend his free time helping a young woman set up a seamstress shop, that was his business. One afternoon, about a week after he had first found Zelda crying on the platform, Xavier arrived at the shop to find her in conversation with two women. He recognized them as the wives of local merchants, respectable women whose opinion carried weight in the small community. They were examining a dress Zelda had displayed on the dress form, a simple but elegantly cut garment she had made from some of the fabric they had purchased. "This stitching is excellent," one of the women was saying. "Very fine work." "Thank you, Mrs. Reynolds," Zelda said. "I would be happy to make something for you if you are interested. I can do custom work or alterations, whatever you need." When the women left, both having placed orders for new dresses, Zelda turned to Xavier with a smile that lit up her entire face. "My first customers," she said, and there was such joy in her voice that Xavier felt his heart skip a beat. "I told you that you would do well," he said, trying to ignore the way his pulse had quickened. Over the following weeks, Zelda's business began to grow slowly but steadily. Women came in for alterations, for mending, and gradually for custom dresses. Word spread that the new seamstress in town did beautiful work at fair prices, and that she was reliable and professional. Zelda worked long hours, often sewing by lamplight late into the evening, determined to establish herself and begin paying Xavier back. Xavier continued to stop by regularly, telling himself he was just checking on his investment. He brought her lunch sometimes, bread and cheese from Mrs. Fletcher or a hot meal from the restaurant on Main Street. They would sit together in the back room of the shop, eating and talking about their days. Zelda proved to have a quick wit and a sharp sense of humor that emerged more as she relaxed into her new life. Xavier found himself laughing more in her presence than he had in years. He learned that she loved books, but had rarely had access to them. He borrowed volumes from the ranch owner's small library and brought them to her. She was delighted, and they began discussing the stories, arguing good-naturedly about characters and plot twists. He discovered that she had a beautiful singing voice when he arrived at the shop one day to hear her humming as she worked. She blushed when she realized he had heard her, but he asked her to continue, and the sound of her voice became one of his favorite things about visiting the shop. For her part, Zelda found herself looking forward to Xavier's visits with an anticipation that both warmed and frightened her. She had never known a man like him, someone who was kind without expecting anything in return, who treated her with respect and genuine interest. He was handsome in a rugged way, with sun-weathered skin and strong hands that were surprisingly gentle. When he smiled, which he did more often as they grew to know each other, it transformed his face and made her stomach flutter in a way she tried very hard to ignore. She told herself she was simply grateful to him, that her feelings were nothing more than the natural affection one would feel towards someone who had rescued them from desperation. But late at night, lying in her room at Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house, she found herself thinking about the way Xavier's eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed, or the way he listened to her with complete attention when she spoke, as if her words mattered more than anything else in the world. 2 months after Zelda had arrived in Hill City, autumn had fully taken hold. The leaves on the cottonwood trees turned gold, and there was a crisp chill in the morning air. Zelda's shop was doing well enough that she was able to make her first payment to Xavier, a small amount that barely made a dent in what she owed him, but she insisted he take it. "It is a matter of principle," she said firmly, pressing the money into his hand. "You invested in me, and I am paying you back." "I am not worried about being paid back," Xavier said, but he took the money because he could see it mattered to her. They were standing in the shop after hours, the lamps casting a warm glow over the bolts of fabric, and the work tables scattered with pins and thread. It had become a comfortable routine, Xavier stopping by at the end of the day when Zelda was closing up, sometimes helping her tidy or just sitting and talking while she finished her last bits of work. "I know you are not worried," Zelda said, "but I am. I need to stand on my own 2 feet, Xavier. I need to prove that I can do this." "You have already proven it," he said gently. "Look around you. You have built a successful business in 2 months. You have customers who value your work. You have made a place for yourself here." Zelda looked around the shop and her expression softened. "I suppose I have," she said slowly. "It does not feel real sometimes. I keep thinking I am going to wake up and find myself back on that platform with nowhere to go and no one to help me." "That is not going to happen," Xavier said. "You are here to stay." She turned to look at him, and there was something in her eyes that made his breath catch. "Am I?" she asked softly. "Am I here to stay, Xavier?" He understood what she was really asking. In the 2 months since he had found her crying on the platform, they had become friends, perhaps the closest friend either of them had ever had. But there was something else growing between them, something neither had acknowledged aloud but both felt in the long looks and the comfortable silences, and the way they seemed to orbit each other. "I hope you are," Xavier said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I've gotten used to having you here." "Just the town, you mean," Zelda said, but there was a question in her voice. "The town is glad to have a seamstress." "Not just the town," Xavier admitted. He took a step closer to her, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender she wore. "I am glad, very glad." Zelda's cheeks flushed pink and she looked down at her hands. "Xavier," she started, then seemed to lose courage. "Yes. I need to tell you something," she said, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "When you found me on that platform, I thought my life was over. I had come so far, used everything I had, and it seemed like it had all been for nothing. I was not just crying because I was scared or disappointed. I was crying because I thought I had finally run out of chances. And then you appeared, this stranger who had no reason to help me, and you gave me hope when I had none. You gave me more than money or a business opportunity. You gave me back my belief that good things were possible." Xavier felt something tighten in his chest. "Zelda," he said, but she held up a hand. "Let me finish," she said. "I need to say this. Over these past weeks I have come to care for you deeply, more than I should probably, more than is wise, but I cannot help it. You are in my thoughts all the time. I look forward to seeing you every day. When I accomplish something, you are the first person I want to tell. And I do not know what to do about these feelings because I owe you so much already, and I do not want you to think that I am just grateful, or that I feel obligated, but I think it is more than that. I think I am falling in love with you, and it terrifies me." The words hung in the air between them. Xavier stared at her, his heart pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. He had imagined this moment in various ways over the past weeks, but he had never quite let himself believe it could be real. "Zelda," he said again, and this time he reached out and took her hand. "I have been falling in love with you since the moment I saw you on that platform. I told myself I was just being kind, just being a decent human being, but the truth is, I could not walk away from you. Something in me recognized something in you, and I have not been able to stop thinking about you since. Every day I wake up and find some reason to come to town, some excuse to see you. I do not want to frighten you or make you uncomfortable, but I need you to know that you are not alone in what you are feeling." Zelda's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Truly," she whispered. "Truly," Xavier said. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "I love you, Zelda Sullivan. I think I have loved you from the very beginning." She let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob, and then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. Xavier held her close, breathing in the scent of lavender and feeling the way she fit perfectly against him. They stood like that for a long moment, just holding each other, letting the truth of their feelings settle between them. When they finally pulled apart, Zelda was wiping at her eyes and laughing. "I am sorry," she said. "I seem to cry every time something significant happens." "I do not mind your tears," Xavier said, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "Not when they come with that smile." They sat together on the bench by the window, hands intertwined, and talked about what came next. Xavier was careful to make sure Zelda understood that his feelings came with no expectations or obligations. He did not want her to feel pressured because of what he had done for her. But Zelda was firm in her insistence that her feelings were genuine and separate from any sense of debt. "I would love you if you had not invested a penny in my shop," she said. "The shop is wonderful, and I am grateful beyond words, but that is not why I love you. I love you because you are kind and good, because you listen when I talk and you make me laugh, because when I am with you, I feel safe in a way I have never felt before, because you see me, really see me, not just as a seamstress or a charity case, but as a person with thoughts and dreams and value." "You have more value than you know," Xavier said softly. "And I intend to spend as much time as you will let me proving that to you." They began courting properly after that, though in a small town like Hill City, there were not many formal courting activities available. Xavier took her to church socials and town dances. They went on picnics in the hills when the weather was still mild enough, riding out on Xavier's horse with Zelda seated in front of him, her back against his chest. They walked through town in the evenings, stopping to look at the stars when they were far enough from the buildings that the lamps did not obscure the view. Zelda met the people Xavier worked with at the Double J Ranch, and they accepted her with easy warmth. The ranch owner, a man named Jacob Jenkins who was in his 60s, took a particular liking to her and told Xavier privately that he would be a fool if he did not marry her. "That woman has backbone," Jacob said approvingly. "Came out here with nothing and built herself a life. That is the kind of woman who will stand by you when times are hard." Xavier did not need convincing. The question of marriage was in his mind constantly, but he wanted to give Zelda time to be sure of her feelings, to be certain that this was what she truly wanted and not just the result of gratitude or circumstance. Winter came to the Black Hills with a vengeance, bringing snow and bitter cold. Zelda continued to work in her shop, though business slowed somewhat as people ventured out less in the harsh weather. Xavier worried about her constantly, about whether she was warm enough, whether she was eating properly, whether she was lonely. He installed a better stove in the shop to keep her warm while she worked, and he made sure she always had firewood and coal. One evening in late December, after a heavy snowfall had blanketed the town in white, Xavier arrived at the shop to find Zelda sitting by the stove, wrapped in a shawl with tears running down her face. His heart seized with immediate concern. "What is wrong?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "Are you hurt? Did something happen?" Zelda shook her head, trying to wipe away the tears. "No, I am fine," she said. "I am sorry I am being foolish." "You are not foolish. Tell me what has upset you." She took a shaky breath. "I received a letter today from my aunt in Cincinnati. Somehow she found out where I am. She wrote to tell me that the man she wanted me to marry has died. She said if I came back now, she might be willing to forgive me for the embarrassment I caused her and take me in again." Xavier felt his jaw clench. "What did you write back?" "I have not written anything yet," Zelda said. "I was so angry when I read it and then so sad. Not because I want to go back. I would never go back. But because it made me realize how different my life is now. She thinks she is offering me something valuable, a chance to return to her grudging tolerance. She has no idea that I have built something here that is 1,000 times better than anything she ever gave me." She does not understand that I have people who care about me, that I have work I am proud of, that I have you." "Then that is what you write back," Xavier said gently. "You tell her that you have made a good life here and you have no intention of leaving it." Zelda nodded, then looked at him with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Xavier, I need you to know that I have never been more certain of anything than I am of my feelings for you. When I read that letter, my first thought was not fear or uncertainty. It was gratitude that I am here and not there, that I chose this path, even though it was terrifying, that I found you." Xavier took her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "Marry me," he said, the words coming out before he had consciously decided to say them. "I know it has only been a few months, and I know you wanted to be independent, to stand on your own. You have proven you can do that, but I do not want to spend another day not knowing that you are going to be in my life forever. Marry me, Zelda. Let me stand beside you for the rest of our lives." Zelda's eyes widened, and for a moment she just stared at him. Then a smile broke across her face like sunrise. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Xavier, I will marry you." He kissed her then, a kiss that was tender and passionate and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both of them were smiling so hard their faces hurt. They were married in January of 1883, in the small church in Hill City with Mrs. Fletcher and half the town in attendance. Zelda wore a dress she had made herself, a beautiful creation of cream-colored silk that she had ordered specifically for the occasion. Xavier wore his best suit, which he had bought new for the wedding, wanting to look worthy of the woman standing beside him, Mrs. Fletcher cried throughout the ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Jacob Jenkins stood as Xavier's witness, and one of Zelda's customers, a kind woman named Helen Carter, stood as hers. The preacher spoke about love and commitment and the importance of partnership in building a life together. And Xavier barely heard a word, too focused on Zelda's face, on the way she looked at him like he was the answer to every prayer she had ever whispered. After the ceremony, there was a reception at the boarding house with food and music and dancing. Xavier held Zelda in his arms as they swayed to a fiddle tune, and she rested her head against his chest. "Are you happy?" he murmured into her hair. "Happier than I knew it was possible to be," she said. "You saved my life, Xavier Winters." "No," he said firmly. "You saved your own life. You had the courage to leave everything you knew and start over. I just helped you along the way." "We saved each other then," Zelda said, looking up at him. "Because I think you were lonely before you found me. I think maybe you needed someone to care for as much as I needed someone to care for me." Xavier could not argue with that. He had been lonely, though he had not fully recognized it until Zelda had come into his life and filled all the empty spaces he had not known existed. They moved into Xavier's cabin on the ranch property, a small but sturdy structure that they immediately began making their own. Zelda added curtains and rugs and small touches that made it feel like a home. She continued to run her shop in town, riding in several days a week while Xavier worked on the ranch. It was a good arrangement, allowing her to maintain her independence while they built their life together. The first year of their marriage was an adjustment, learning each other's habits and rhythms, navigating the small conflicts that arose when two people tried to merge their lives. But the foundation of love and respect they had built was strong enough to weather any storm. Xavier learned that Zelda could be stubborn when she believed she was right, but she was also willing to listen and compromise. Zelda learned that Xavier was quieter than she was, needing time alone to process his thoughts, but that he would always communicate with her if she was patient. Spring came, and with it new life on the ranch. Zelda discovered she was pregnant in April, and the joy on Xavier's face when she told him was something she would remember for the rest of her life. He became even more protective, constantly worried about her health and well-being, insisting she not work too hard. "I am pregnant, not fragile," she told him with amusement when he tried to prevent her from lifting a bolt of fabric. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time." "Not my wife," he said stubbornly. "My wife is going to take it easy and let me take care of her." She humored him when she could and ignored him when she could not, continuing to work in the shop until her pregnancy became too advanced for it to be practical. Mrs. Fletcher stepped in to help manage the shop during the last months, and Zelda trained her in the basics so that customers could still have their simpler needs met. Their son was born in December of 1883, just before Christmas. He came into the world squalling and red-faced, with a shock of dark hair and his father's strong features. They named him Samuel Jacob Winters, after Xavier's father and Jacob Jenkins, the ranch owner who had become like family to them. Xavier held his son for the first time with shaking hands and tears in his eyes. "He is perfect," he whispered to Zelda, who lay exhausted but radiant in their bed. "You did such a good job. He is absolutely perfect." "We made him together," Zelda said with a tired smile. "He is ours." Being parents changed them in ways both subtle and profound. Xavier discovered depths of love and protectiveness he had not known he possessed. Zelda found that the fierce independence she had fought so hard to maintain transformed into a different kind of strength. The strength that came from being part of a family, from knowing she was not alone in facing whatever challenges life brought. Samuel was a healthy, happy baby who grew quickly. By the time he was 6 months old, he was laughing at his father's silly faces and reaching for everything within his grasp. Zelda returned to working in the shop part-time, bringing Samuel with her and setting up a cradle in the back room where he could sleep while she sewed. The years passed in the way years do when life is full and good. Samuel grew into a curious, energetic boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's steady temperament. Zelda's shop continued to thrive, becoming known throughout the region for the quality of her work. Xavier was promoted to assistant foreman at the Double J, a position that came with more responsibility and better pay. In 1886, their daughter was born, a tiny thing they named Emma Claire. She had Xavier's sandy brown hair and Zelda's delicate features, and from the moment she arrived, she had her father wrapped around her little finger. Xavier, who had been a loving but sensibly protective father to Samuel, became absolutely devoted to Emma, carrying her everywhere and refusing to let her cry for even a moment. "You are going to spoil her," Zelda warned, though she was smiling. "Good," Xavier said, bouncing Emma gently in his arms. "She deserves to be spoiled." Samuel adored his little sister, and as they grew, the two became inseparable. The cabin that had once seemed adequate for 2 adults now felt cramped with 2 children, and Xavier began making plans to build a larger house. With the help of other ranch hands and men from town, they constructed a proper home with 3 bedrooms and a real kitchen. Zelda cried with joy when she saw the sewing room Xavier had included specifically for her, with large windows that would let in plenty of natural light. Jacob Jenkins passed away in the winter of 1888, leaving the Double J Ranch to his nephew, a younger man named David, who had been working alongside Jacob for several years. David was fair and hardworking, and he promoted Xavier to foreman, recognizing his dedication and skill. The position meant more money, which Xavier and Zelda saved carefully, always mindful of how quickly circumstances could change and fortunes could be lost. In 1889, they had another son, whom they named William Thomas. He was a calm baby, easy and content, so different from Samuel's energetic infancy that Zelda joked they must have borrowed him from someone else. Xavier just smiled and said they were blessed, which Zelda knew was his way of acknowledging how far they had come from that day on the train platform. The town of Hill City grew and changed along with their family. More businesses opened, a proper schoolhouse was built, and the rough edges of frontier life gradually smoothed into something more settled and civilized. Zelda's shop remained a fixture, and she took on an apprentice, a young woman named Margaret who reminded Zelda of herself at that age, hungry to learn and desperate for a chance to prove herself. On their 10th wedding anniversary in January of 1893, Xavier took Zelda back to the train station platform where they had first met. It was a cold winter evening, much like the one when he had found her crying all those years ago. "You remember?" he asked, holding her hand as they stood on the platform. "How could I forget?" Zelda said. "This is where my life began, the real life, I mean, the one I chose." "I think about it sometimes," Xavier admitted. "What would have happened if I had just walked past you that day? If I had minded my own business and gone home without stopping?" "But you did not," Zelda said, squeezing his hand. "You stopped. You showed kindness to a stranger when you had no obligation to do so. You changed both of our lives that day." "You would have been fine," Xavier said. "You are too strong and too determined to have let circumstances defeat you. You would have found another way." "Maybe," Zelda allowed, "but it would not have been this way, it would not have been you, and I cannot imagine a life without you in it now." Xavier pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her against the cold. "I love you," he said. "Just as much now as I did the day we married. More, maybe. Is that possible?" "It must be," Zelda said, "because I feel the same way." They stood there together, two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right place, and built something beautiful from the ashes of Zelda's despair and Xavier's loneliness. The train whistle sounded in the distance, mournful and familiar, and Zelda thought about how that sound had once represented the end of her hopes, and now represented the beginning of everything good in her life. The years continued to roll by, marked by the milestones of their children's lives. Samuel grew into a responsible young man who loved working with horses and eventually took a position at a ranch near Rapid City. Emma developed a talent for art and helped her mother design patterns for dresses, adding beautiful embroidered details that became a signature of the shop. William proved to have a head for numbers and helped his father manage the ranch's accounts. In 1895, tragedy struck when a harsh winter brought illness to Hill City. Influenza swept through the town, and many fell sick. The Winters family huddled together in their home, quarantining themselves as much as possible, but Emma caught the illness. For 3 terrifying days, she burned with fever while Zelda and Xavier took turns sitting by her bedside, applying cool cloths and praying desperately for her recovery. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Emma opened her eyes and asked for water in a weak voice, and Zelda burst into tears of relief. Xavier held both his wife and daughter, his own eyes wet, and thanked God for sparing their child. The illness left Emma weakened for several weeks, but she gradually regained her strength, and the experience brought the family even closer together, reminding them of how precious their time together was. As the 19th century drew to a close, Xavier and Zelda found themselves in their 40s, no longer young but still healthy and active. They had weathered storms both literal and figurative, supported each other through challenges, and celebrated each other's triumphs. The love that had begun on a train platform in Hill City had deepened into something that could not be shaken by time or hardship. Samuel married in 1898, bringing home a sweet-natured young woman named Caroline, who Zelda welcomed with open arms, delighted to have a daughter-in-law who loved her son so clearly. Their first grandchild, a boy named Xavier after his grandfather, was born in 1899, and holding him for the first time made Xavier emotional in a way he had not expected. "I never thought I would live to see this," he told Zelda that evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the Black Hills. "Grandchildren, a whole family that grew from the two of us. We have been blessed," Zelda said simply. She rested her head on his shoulder, comfortable in the silence that came from decades of companionship. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" "All the time," Xavier admitted. "But I try not to dwell on it. We got the life we have, and I would not trade it for anything." Emma married in 1901 to a banker's son from Rapid City, a thoughtful young man named Robert who treated her like she hung the moon. The wedding was a grand affair by Hill City standards, with Zelda creating a dress for Emma that was talked about for months afterward. William showed no signs of settling down yet, declaring that he was too busy helping his father manage the ranch to think about marriage. As they moved into the 20th century, Xavier and Zelda began to think about slowing down. Xavier was 50 years old and still working hard, but his body reminded him regularly that he was not a young man anymore. Zelda's eyes strained from years of close sewing work, and she found herself needing spectacles to continue her detailed embroidery. They talked about retirement, about what they wanted for the next phase of their lives. Zelda considered selling the shop, but the thought made her sad. It had been her salvation, her path to independence, and letting it go felt like abandoning part of herself. In the end, she decided to keep it but work fewer hours, focusing only on the projects that truly interested her and leaving the day-to-day operations to Margaret, who had become skilled enough to run things independently. Xavier stepped back from his foreman duties, training a younger man to take over most of the responsibilities while he stayed on as an advisor. David, the ranch owner, was grateful to retain Xavier's experience and knowledge without requiring him to do the physically demanding work anymore. This new arrangement gave them more time together, and they treasured it. They took long walks in the hills, rode out to the places they had visited during their courtship, and spent evenings on their porch talking about everything and nothing. Their children were grown and building their own lives. Their grandchildren were healthy and thriving, and they had the luxury of enjoying each other's company without the pressing demands of work and child-raising. In 1905, they celebrated their 22nd wedding anniversary by returning once again to the train platform. It had become a tradition of sorts, this pilgrimage to the place where their story began. The platform looked different now. The town had grown enough to warrant a larger station, with a proper waiting room and an expanded platform. But the bench where Zelda had sat crying all those years ago was still there, weathered but sturdy. They sat together on that bench, holding hands like young lovers, though they were both well into middle age now. Xavier's hair had gone gray at the temples, and there were lines on his face that spoke of years spent working outdoors. Zelda's blonde hair was threaded with silver, and time had added weight to her figure, but to Xavier she was as beautiful as the day he had first seen her. "I have been thinking," Zelda said, breaking the comfortable silence, "about writing down our story. For the grandchildren, so they know where they came from." "That is a good idea," Xavier said. "What will you tell them?" "The truth," Zelda said. "That I came west with nothing but hope and it was not enough, that I thought I had reached the end of everything. And then a cowboy found me crying on this platform, and his kindness turned my tears to hope. That he gave me a chance when I desperately needed one, and that chance grew into a life more wonderful than I had ever imagined possible." Xavier smiled. "Make sure you tell them that you built that life yourself. I just provided the initial push." "We built it together," Zelda corrected. Every step of the way we chose each other and chose this life. That is what I want them to know. That love and kindness and determination can create something lasting and beautiful. Then, that is what you should write, Xavier said, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. They sat there as the sun set, painting the sky in colors that reminded Zelda of that first evening when Xavier had found her. 22 years had passed since that day, years filled with joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge, but most of all filled with love. The desperate young woman who had cried on this platform had become a confident mother and grandmother, a successful businesswoman, a beloved member of her community. And it had all started with one man's decision to stop and help, to extend kindness to a stranger in need. The years that followed continued to be good to them. More grandchildren arrived and then great-grandchildren. Samuel took over operation of his own ranch, building on the skills his father had taught him. Emma's artistic talents led her to open a small gallery in Rapid City, showcasing local artists. William eventually married a widow with 2 children of her own, instantly creating a ready-made family that suited his generous nature perfectly. Xavier and Zelda watched all of this unfold from their comfortable home in Hill City, the center around which their growing family orbited. Holidays brought the house alive with children and grandchildren, filling every room with noise and laughter. Zelda cooked enormous meals with help from her daughters-in-law, and Xavier told stories to wide-eyed grandchildren about the old days, when Hill City was barely more than a handful of buildings, and the West was still wild. In 1912, they celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary. The town threw them a party at the church, recognizing not just their marriage but their contribution to the community over the decades. Zelda's shop had provided employment and service to countless women. Xavier's work at the ranch had helped establish Hill City as a viable cattle town. Together, they had raised children who had become productive, kind members of society. Speeches were made praising their commitment to each other and to the community. Their children stood up and shared stories about growing up with parents who loved each other so obviously and completely. Zelda cried, of course, but these were happy tears, tears of gratitude and joy. When it was Xavier's turn to speak, he stood slowly, feeling his age in his joints but strong enough in his heart. He looked at Zelda, who smiled at him encouragingly. "I am not much for public speaking," he began, and gentle laughter rippled through the crowd. "But I want to say this. 30 years ago, I made the best decision of my life. I stopped when I could have kept walking. I helped when I could have looked away. I took a chance on a woman I did not know, and she gave me everything I never knew I needed. Zelda made me a better man, a happier man, and I have spent 30 years trying to be worthy of her love. I hope I have succeeded at least a little." Zelda stood and went to him, taking his hand. "You succeeded," she said softly, though in the quiet room everyone could hear. "Every single day you succeeded." They kissed to thunderous applause, and in that moment, surrounded by everyone they loved in the town they had helped build, they felt the culmination of everything that had started on a train platform so many years ago. The second decade of the 20th century brought changes to the world. Technology advanced rapidly, and the old ways of the frontier gave way to modernity. Automobiles began appearing on the streets of Hill City, competing with horses and wagons. The ranch transitioned from open-range cattle driving to more modern methods of livestock management. Zelda's shop adapted to changing fashions, though she held firm on quality over speed. Through all these changes, Xavier and Zelda remained constants in each other's lives, their love the one thing that never changed or wavered. They grew old together with grace, accepting the limitations that age brought but never losing their fundamental connection to each other. Xavier's health began to decline in his early 70s. Nothing dramatic, just the slow wearing down of a body that had worked hard for decades. He moved more slowly, tired more easily, spent more time in his chair on the porch than working on the ranch. Zelda, herself in her 70s, cared for him with tenderness, never complaining about the role reversal that had her looking after the man who had once looked after her. "I am sorry," Xavier said one evening, frustrated with his own weakness after she had helped him up the porch steps. "For what?" Zelda asked, settling into the chair beside him. "For not being able to do as much, for needing help, for being old." Zelda took his hand, running her thumb over the age spots and calluses, the hand she knew as well as her own. "Do you remember what you told me that first night when you took me to Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house?" "I said a lot of things that night." "You said that everyone deserves a chance," Zelda reminded him. "You gave me a chance when I needed it most. Now it is my turn to take care of you. It is not a burden, Xavier. It is a privilege." He squeezed her hand, his eyes bright with emotion. "I love you," he said. "I never get tired of saying it, even after all these years." "I love you too," Zelda replied, "and I never get tired of hearing it." Xavier passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1918 at the age of 71. He simply did not wake up one morning, having gone to bed the night before after a pleasant evening with Zelda, talking about their plans to visit Samuel and his family the following week. Zelda woke to find him still and cold beside her, and though she had known this day would come eventually, the reality of it hit her like a physical blow. The funeral was attended by what seemed like the entire town. 3 generations of Winters stood together, mourning the man who had been husband, father, grandfather, and great-grandfather. Friends and colleagues spoke about Xavier's integrity, his kindness, his steady presence in their community. But it was Zelda's words, spoken in a voice that shook but never broke, that people remembered most. "My husband was not a perfect man," she said, standing before the gathering at the church. "He was stubborn sometimes, and he worried too much, and he could never remember where he put his hat. But he was good, deeply, fundamentally good. He saw someone in need and he helped, expecting nothing in return. That simple act of kindness, stopping to help a stranger crying on a train platform, gave me my whole life. It gave all of you your father, your grandfather, your friend." Xavier believed that how we treat people matters, that small acts of compassion can change everything. He lived that belief every single day, and because of him, the world is better. Zelda lived for another 4 years after Xavier's death. She moved in with William and his family, who cared for her with the same love and devotion she had shown them throughout their lives. She spent her days with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing on stories about their grandfather and great-grandfather, making sure they understood the legacy of kindness and love he had left behind. She returned to the train platform one final time, a few months before her own death. William pushed her in a wheelchair, as her legs no longer had the strength to carry her far. They sat together in the spring sunshine, and Zelda looked at the bench where she had once sat crying, her world in pieces around her. "This is where it all began," she told William, who had heard the story many times but listened patiently anyway. "This is where I met your father, where he gave me hope when I had none. Every good thing in my life came from this moment, from his choice to stop and help me." "He was a good man," William said. "The best," Zelda agreed. "And now I will see him again soon, I feel it." She was right. Zelda passed away quietly that summer in her sleep like her beloved Xavier. She was 77 years old and had lived a full, rich life beyond anything she could have imagined on that desperate evening in 1882. At her funeral, Her children and grandchildren shared memories. They talked about her strength, her talent, her fierce love for her family. But it was her great-granddaughter, a young woman named Zelda who had been named after her, who perhaps understood her best. Great-grandma used to tell me that the bravest thing she ever did was get on that train to Hill City, young Zelda said. She had nothing, no guarantees, just hope that things could be better. And when that hope failed, when she thought she had reached the end, great-grandpa Xavier gave it back to her. He showed her that kindness still existed in the world, that good people still cared about strangers. She never forgot that gift, and she spent the rest of her life passing it on. She helped so many people through the years, just like great-grandpa helped her. That is the legacy they left us, not just their love story, but the reminder that we have the power to change someone's life with a simple act of compassion. They buried Zelda next to Xavier in the Hill City Cemetery, under a cottonwood tree with a view of the Black Hills they had both loved. Their gravestone was simple, bearing their names and dates, and one line that Zelda had requested. They stopped to help and changed the world. Years later, the story of Xavier and Zelda Winters became a piece of Hill City history, passed down through generations. The train platform where they met was eventually designated a historical site, with a plaque telling their story. Young couples would stand there, imagining that desperate meeting and the love story that had grown from it. Their descendants spread across the country, but many remained in South Dakota, carrying on the values of kindness and compassion that Xavier and Zelda had exemplified. The seamstress shop, though it changed hands many times, remained in operation for decades, and people said it carried a special feeling, as if Zelda's dedication and skill had soaked into the very walls. The ranch where Xavier had worked continued to thrive, and the current owners made sure new employees knew the story of Xavier Winters, the cowboy who had believed in giving people chances and treating everyone with respect and dignity. But perhaps the truest memorial to Xavier and Zelda was not physical at all. It was in the countless acts of kindness performed by people who had heard their story and been inspired by it. People who stopped to help strangers, who gave chances to those who needed them, who chose compassion over indifference. Every time someone reached out a helping hand, every time someone turned tears to hope, the legacy of Xavier and Zelda lived on. Their love story, which had begun with such despair on a train platform in 1882, had rippled outward through time and space, touching lives they would never know about, inspiring goodness in people they would never meet. It proved that the smallest acts of kindness could have the largest impacts, that love could grow in the most unexpected places, and that choosing to care about another person's suffering could change not just their life, but your own as well. Xavier Winters had found Zelda Sullivan crying on a train platform, had offered her kindness when she desperately needed it, and in doing so had set in motion a love story that would last decades and touch generations. He had turned her tears to hope, and she had given him a family and a love that sustained him all his life. Together, they had built something beautiful and lasting, proving that even in the hard, unforgiving landscape of the Wild West, tenderness and compassion could not just survive, but thrive. Their story ended as all good stories do, with lives well lived, love deeply felt, and a legacy that endured long after they were gone. The cowboy and the seamstress, brought together by chance and bound together by choice, had shown everyone who knew them what it meant to truly love and be loved in return. And that, more than anything, was the happy ending they both deserved.